somewhere beneath the burning, bone-dry Saharan sands, in a place no satellite has yet photographed and no archaeologist has ever excavated. There may lie the single greatest concentration of gold the ancient world ever produced, a hoard so vast, so incomprehensibly enormous, that when its owner briefly released even a fraction of it into the global economy in the year 1324, he did not merely enrich the cities he passed through, he broke them. He shattered the price of gold across the entire Mediterranean world for more than a decade, collapsing economies that had taken centuries to stabilize, reducing prosperous merchants to poverty overnight, and embedding his name, Mansa Musa, the Lion King of Mali, so deeply into the nightmares of Egyptian and Arab financiers that they wrote about him with trembling pens for generations afterward. If this story grips you the way it grips me, and I promise you it will, smash that like button right now and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss a single episode. We cover the stories that textbooks either skip or sanitize, the histories that are still actively being argued over, the empires and rulers and treasure trails that refuse to be forgotten. And before we dive in, I want to know two things in the comments. First, where in the world are you watching this from right now? Because this channel has viewers from Lagos to London to Lahore, and I want to know who is out there. And second, what empire or historical mystery should we cover next? The Songhai Empire, the gold mines of Great Zimbabwe, the vanished navy of Shanghai. Leave your vote below. The most requested topic becomes our next script. Long before the word Mali existed in any language, long before any king sat beneath any golden canopy in any court in West Africa, human beings were already living and dying and building along the broad, slow bend of the Niger River. We are talking about a world that existed roughly 5,000 years before Mansa Musa was born. A time when the Sahara itself was not the impassable wall of death it later became, but a greener, wetter, more forgiving landscape dotted with lakes and rivers and grasslands where ancient herders drove their cattle. These proto-Saharan peoples, ancestors of the Mande-speaking populations who would one day construct the Mali Empire, left their mark in the rock art of the Tassili Enadger Plateau in what is now Algeria. Paintings of swimmers and hunters and dancers, executed with extraordinary grace on cliff faces that have since been surrounded by nothing but sand and silence. As the Sahara dried over millennia, these ancient communities were pushed southward toward the Niger River basin, where the soil was richer, the rains more reliable, and where the gold-bearing rivers of the Bambuk and Bure regions offered a resource that would, one day, make their descendants the most powerful rulers on earth. It is a story that begins not in the palaces of kings, but in the red dust of a landscape learning to be a desert. And it is a story that, in one crucial sense, has never truly ended. Before Mali ever rose, before the word Musa ever echoed in a royal court, there was Ghana, not the modern nation we know today, but an ancient kingdom of astonishing wealth and sophistication that held dominion over the Western Sudan for nearly 3 centuries. Around the year 700 CE, the Soninke people, under the leadership of a dynasty whose founder tradition remembers as Dingasis, consolidated the scattered chiefdoms of the upper Niger-Senegal basin into a unified political entity that Arab traders would call Wagadu, and later come to know simply as Ghana, a title meaning war chief. The ruler of this Ghana sat not merely on a throne, but upon a throne literally decorated with gold and ivory, surrounded by horses whose bridles gleamed with solid gold fittings, attended by guards carrying golden shields and swords. The Arab geographer al-Bakri, writing in 1068, described the court of the Ghana king with barely concealed awe. The king held audience in a pavilion surrounded by 10 horses wearing gold-trimmed garments, attended by the sons of subject kings with gold-braided hair, and guarded by dogs wearing gold and silver collars, animals considered sacred enough to receive their own ceremonial necklaces. If that detail does not already tell you everything you need to know about how much gold flowed through this kingdom, nothing will. The single greatest achievement of the Ghana Empire was not military conquest, though it conquered plenty. It was not architectural, though the capital city of Kumbai-Sale, excavated partially by 20th century archaeologists in modern Mauritania, revealed a metropolis of stone buildings and mosques capable of housing 30,000 people. The greatest achievement of Ghana was the invention of the first systematic gold monopoly in sub-Saharan African history. The Soninke rulers of Ghana did not mine gold themselves. The actual mining took place in the Bambuk and Bure goldfields to the south, in territories controlled by peoples who maintained strict secrecy about the exact locations of their mines, even from their own trading partners. Instead, Ghana positioned itself as the indispensable middleman between the gold-producing south and the salt-hungry, gold-starved Arab and Berber traders of the north. Every nugget of gold that crossed the Sahara passed through Ghana's hands first, and the king collected a tax on every transaction. 1 gold dinar on every donkey load of salt entering the kingdom, 2 gold dinars on every load leaving it. The result was a treasury of almost incomprehensible scale, and the secret weapon the king used to maintain the gold's value was extraordinary. By royal decree, the king confiscated every nugget of gold found anywhere in the kingdom, leaving only gold dust for ordinary commerce. The nuggets, some of them allegedly as large as boulders, though this is surely Arab hyperbole, were kept in the royal treasury to prevent market flooding. Mansa Musa, centuries later, apparently never read this manual, but then, in 1076, the Almoravid dynasty, a movement of Berber Muslim reformers who had already swept northward to seize Morocco and later Spain, swept southward Instead, led by Abu Bakr ibn Umar, approximately 20,000 Almoravid warriors crossed the desert and besieged Cambysail. The Ghana king, whose name history has not preserved with certainty, fought back with an army that Arab sources estimate at 200,000, an almost certainly exaggerated figure, but suggestive of a kingdom that could still mobilize formidable resistance. Yet Cambysail fell. The gold monopoly fractured. The trade routes shifted. The brilliant economic machine that the Soninke had constructed over 4 centuries began its slow, grinding collapse. And the vacuum it left behind would prove irresistible to a new people rising along the upper Niger, a people called the Mandinka, led by a dynasty called the Keita, and destined to build something that would make even Ghana look modest. With the fall of Ghana, the stage was cleared for the most explosive political transformation West Africa had ever seen. And it began, as the most dramatic moments in history always do, with a single act of almost unimaginable personal courage by a man who had no right to survive what came next. It was at this moment, in the early 13th century, that history handed its pen to one of the most extraordinary figures in the entire African historical record. His name was Sundiata Keita, and everything about him defied expectation. Born around 1217 CE, the son of the Mandinka chief Nair Magan Konate and his second wife Sogolin Kande, Sundiata was, by every conventional measure, a poor candidate for greatness. He was reportedly unable to walk until late childhood. The oral traditions, recorded by generations of griots who memorized and transmitted the history of Mali like living libraries, describe him as a boy who crawled while other children ran, who was mocked by the sons of noblemen, whose own mother was publicly humiliated by the reigning queen. And then one day he stood up. The griot traditions, and these are oral histories stretching back 8 centuries, maintained with stunning consistency across dozens of regional variants, describe Sundiata seizing an iron rod and bending it into a bow shape with his bare hands as he rose to his feet for the first time. The muscles in his legs visibly reshaping themselves beneath his skin as years of compressed potential finally released. Whether this is historical fact or biographical myth matters less than what it communicates about how his people understood him. As someone who transformed suffering into power, who turned humiliation into legacy, and who would, when the moment came, bend not iron, but kingdoms. The moment came in 1235 CE, at the Battle of Kirina. The Saso Empire, led by a king named Sumanguru Kante, a figure so terrifying to the oral tradition that he is described as a sorcerer king, who kept 9 skins of defeated enemies stretched across his throne, who wore a hat made of human skulls, and who is credited with the magical ability to transform into a vulture, had destroyed the remnants of Ghana and turned its domination toward the Mandinka people subjugating 12 Mandinka kings and making tributaries of them all. Sundiata, by now a young commander who had spent years in exile gathering allies and warriors across the western Sudan, returned to challenge Suminguru at Kirina. The battle itself is one of the most discussed in West African military history. Griots describe the armies gathering on a plain of trampled grass, the two commanders facing each other across a field wide enough to hold the fates of a dozen peoples. Sundiata defeated Suminguru so decisively that the Saso Empire effectively ceased to exist as a political entity within a generation. And from the ruins, Sundiata proclaimed the Mali Empire, a confederation of chieftaincies, vassal states, and directly ruled provinces that would eventually stretch from the Atlantic coast in the west to the bend of the Niger in the east, encompassing territory roughly equivalent to modern Western Europe. The Mali Empire at its height covered approximately 1.29 million square kilometers and controlled the trade of an entire continent's worth of gold and salt, all flowing through the hands of the Keita dynasty that Sundiata founded, a dynasty that would, 6 generations later, produce the most spectacular public display of wealth in the entire history of money. The cultural achievement of this founding era deserves more than a footnote. Sundiata's victory did not merely produce a new political map. It produced a new civilization. The Griot tradition, which had existed in scattered forms among Mandinka peoples before, crystallized in this period into one of the most sophisticated oral literary traditions anywhere in the medieval world. The Epic of Sundiata, the Sundiata Fossa, became a living document, updated and recited and sung at royal courts, a combination of political charter, religious text, genealogical record, and narrative poem that contained within it the entire memory of a people's journey from scattered villages to continental empire. More than 8 centuries after Sundiata's victory at Kirina, griots in Mali, Guinea, and Senegal still recite versions of this epic from memory, their voices carrying the cadences and the place names and the emotional truth of a story so old it predates the printing press by 200 years. That cultural continuity is, in its own way, a more remarkable achievement than any military campaign. Yet, the Mali Empire, even in its founding generation, carried within it the seeds of a structural vulnerability that no ruler, not even Mansa Musa, would ever fully resolve. The empire was too large, too diverse, and too dependent on the personal authority of the king to maintain internal coherence through conventional administrative means. When strong kings sat on the throne, the empire functioned with breathtaking efficiency. When weak or contested successions destabilized the center, the periphery immediately began to pull away. And the gold, always the gold, became both the prize that held the confederation together and the motive force that drove its most ambitious vassals toward independence. This instability continued until a series of strong rulers in the mid-13th and early 14th centuries, rebuilt and expanded the empire, none more consequentially than the man who would seize the throne in 1312 CE and transform Mali from a merely impressive regional power into something the world had never seen before and has arguably never seen since. Then, from the tangled politics of succession that had plagued the Keita court for years, a single man emerged to claim the throne, and history has never been the same. Musa Keita, known to history as Mansa Musa, the king of kings of the Mali Empire, came to power in approximately 1312 CE under circumstances that remain somewhat murky even today. The account most commonly referenced comes from Ibn Khaldun, the great 14th century Arab historian, who recorded a story that Musa himself told to an Egyptian official during the famous 1324 Hajj. According to Musa, his predecessor, the previous Mansa, whose name sources give variously as Abu Bakr II or Abubakari II, had become obsessed with the question of what lay beyond the Atlantic Ocean. In the early 14th century, the Atlantic was not merely unknown to sub-Saharan Africans. It was known to be unknown, a void so absolute that even the most experienced Arab navigators refused to speculate about what lay to its west. But Abu Bakr II, according to Musa's account, was not deterred by such caution. He reportedly assembled 2,000 canoes, a fleet of extraordinary ambition, provisioned them with enough food and water for years of exploration, loaded them with warriors and sailors, and everything a voyage into the unknown might require, and sailed west into the Atlantic. He never returned. No wreckage was ever found. No survivor ever reappeared. Whether this story is historical fact, whether Abu Bakr II truly launched history's most ambitious pre-Columbian Atlantic expedition, perhaps reaching the Americas nearly 2 centuries before Columbus, or whether it is a diplomatic fiction crafted by Musa to explain an otherwise embarrassing succession, remains one of the most delicious open questions in medieval history. What is not in question is that by 1312, Mansa Musa sat on the throne of Mali, and he was about to redefine what it meant to be rich. The scale of Mansa Musa's empire and wealth requires some architectural scaffolding to properly appreciate, because the raw numbers, stripped of context, simply do not register the way they should in a modern mind calibrated to think in billions. At the height of his power, Mansa Musa controlled territory that encompassed what are today the nations of Mali, Senegal, Gambia, Guinea, Guinea-Bissau, Mauritania, and significant portions of Niger and Burkina Faso. His empire produced approximately half of the entire world's gold supply at a time when gold was not merely a luxury commodity, but the literal foundation of every functioning economy on Earth. The medium through which international trade was conducted, the material from which coinage was struck across the Mediterranean, and the Middle East, the substance that backed the financial systems of kingdoms from England to China. Modern economists, working backward from contemporary gold prices and production estimates, have attempted to calculate Mansa Musa's net worth in present-day terms, and have consistently arrived at figures so astronomical that the calculation itself becomes meaningless. One widely cited estimate placed his fortune at approximately 400 billion US dollars, though others argue the figure is either far too high or simply incalculable, because no meaningful modern analogy exists. He did not merely own a lot of gold. He owned the world's gold supply. He was, in a very real structural sense, what gold was. The cultural and architectural flowering of the Mansa Musa era represents the single greatest burst of Islamic scholarship and construction in sub-Saharan African history, and it happened largely because of what occurred in 1324. The Hajj, the pilgrimage, the event that shook the Mediterranean world to its foundations and created the legend that has echoed for 700 years since. In 1324, Mansa Musa announced his intention to perform the Hajj to Mecca, a religious obligation for every Muslim who has the means to undertake it, but not typically an event that destabilizes continental economies. Musa's Hajj was different. He departed from his capital at Naini in the western Sudan with a retinue that contemporary Arab sources describe in numbers ranging from the plausible to the barely credible. The Egyptian scholar and diplomat Al-Umari, who interviewed people in Cairo who had personally witnessed Musa's arrival, recorded that the Mansa traveled with 60,000 porters, each carrying a staff of solid gold weighing roughly 2 kilograms. He traveled with 12,000 enslaved servants, each dressed in brocade and Persian silk. He traveled with 500 heralds marching ahead of him, each carrying a staff of gold. He traveled with 80 to 100 camels, each loaded with 300 pounds of gold dust. A detail so specific and so consistently reported across multiple independent sources that historians generally accept it as roughly accurate. And he traveled, above all, with an attitude toward gold that was the precise opposite of the careful, monopoly-maintaining philosophy of the old Ghana kings. He gave it away. He gave it away in quantities so reckless, so theatrical, so genuinely breathtaking in their generosity, that the economies of every city he passed through were fundamentally altered by his passage. In Cairo, where Musa spent several months on his way to and from Mecca, the encounter between the Mali king and the Egyptian Mamluk Sultan al-Nasir Mohammed produced a diplomatic incident so bizarre it was still being written about a century later. Musa, upon meeting the Sultan's representative, reportedly refused to prostrate himself in the traditional gesture of submission because, he explained through interpreters, he prostrated himself only before God. The Sultan, recognizing that this was a man whose gold reserves exceeded those of the Egyptian treasury by a considerable margin, chose not to press the issue. Musa then proceeded to distribute gold to mosques, to officials, to merchants, to beggars, to anyone who crossed his path, distributing so much gold dust and gold coin in the markets of Cairo that the price of gold in that city collapsed by approximately 25% and did not recover for 12 years. 12 years. The economic disruption caused by a single man's generosity lasted longer than the First World War. Merchants who had built their livelihoods around gold trading were ruined. The carefully calibrated gold-to-silver ratios that underpinned Mediterranean commerce were thrown into chaos. And the man responsible for all of this financial devastation reportedly did not notice, or if he noticed, did not particularly care, because he was, after all, on his way to perform a religious obligation, and the gold was merely a tool for expressing piety. On his return journey from Mecca, Musa encountered something unprecedented, a shortage in his own treasury. The astonishing spending of the outward journey, the gifts, the lavish charity, the distribution of gold dust as casually as a modern tourist might hand out business cards, had apparently depleted his immediately accessible reserves more substantially than expected. In an episode that says more about the real scale of his wealth than almost any other single fact, Musa responded to this cash flow problem by borrowing gold. He borrowed it from Egyptian merchants at high interest rates. He, the man who controlled half the world's gold supply, took out loans, and he paid them back in full upon his return, because the gold in his vaults back in Mali was functionally inexhaustible, and because the concept of personal financial insecurity was simply not something Mansa Musa had any experience with. The merchants who lent him gold made enormous profits. They also, presumably, spent considerable time afterward trying to understand what had just happened to them. The cultural achievement of Musa's reign extended far beyond the Hajj itself. On his return journey, he passed through Timbuktu, then a prosperous, but not yet legendary trading city on the Niger River, and decided it needed to be grander. He brought back with him from his travels an Andalusian architect and poet named Abu Ishaq al-Sahili, to whom he paid a fee of 4,000 mithqals of gold, roughly 12 to 14 kilograms, for the journey. Al-Sahili proceeded to design and construct several buildings in Timbuktu and Gao that represented an entirely new architectural tradition in the region, incorporating North African and Andalusian elements into a West African urban landscape for the first time. The most famous of these constructions was the Jingrubber Mosque, completed around 1327, which still stands today in Timbuktu and is still used for Friday prayers nearly 7 centuries after its construction. Musa also invested heavily in the development of the Sankor Mosque and its associated educational complex, which would eventually become the famous University of Sankor, an institution that at its height housed between 25 and 30,000 students, maintained a library of nearly 1 million manuscripts, and attracted scholars from across the Islamic world to study astronomy, mathematics, medicine, law, and theology in a city in the middle of the Sahara, at a time when Oxford University was still a collection of scattered scholars meeting in rented rooms. Timbuktu was a metropolis of learning, funded by the most extravagant personal fortune in human history. But here is where the story takes its first turn toward mystery, and where the treasure trail begins to diverge from the official record. Because while Mansa Musa was spectacularly, publicly distributing gold across the Mediterranean world, he was simultaneously, according to certain oral traditions, certain fragmentary Arabic chronicles, and certain archaeological whispers, doing something else entirely with the deeper reserves of his treasury, something deliberate, something secretive, something that the griots of Mali have hinted at for generations without ever quite saying aloud. He was hiding it. And if those traditions are right, he hid it in a place that no foreign power, no invading army, no collapsing successor state, and no modern archaeologist has yet managed to find. Then in 1337, after approximately 25 years of rule that transformed Mali from a powerful regional state into a continental empire of genuinely global consequence, Mansa Musa died and left behind a question that has never been satisfactorily answered. Where did the gold go? It was at this moment, the moment of Mansa Musa's death in 1337, that the first of several crucial discrepancies in the historical record begins to assert itself with uncomfortable insistence. By any rational accounting of the Mali Empire's income and expenditure during Musa's reign, there should have been far more gold remaining in the royal treasury at his death than subsequent historical events would suggest. The math, such as we can reconstruct it, is genuinely puzzling. Mali's gold-producing regions, primarily the Bambuk goldfields near the Falim River and the Bure goldfields near the upper Niger, were, according to contemporary Arab sources, producing somewhere between 800 and 1,000 kilograms of gold annually that passed through royal hands in taxation and tribute alone, not counting the king's direct access to the mines themselves. Over 25 years of Musa's reign, this represents a minimum of 20,000 kilograms of gold accumulating in the treasury. And this is almost certainly a significant underestimate, because it excludes the gold produced in Bambuk that Musa appears to have controlled more directly than any previous Malian ruler. The gold distributed during the 1324 Hajj, while economically catastrophic for Cairo, represented by any reasonable estimate no more than 10 to 15% of what should have been available. So where was the rest? The successors who followed Musa onto the throne of Mali his son Magan I, who ruled from 1337 to 1341, followed by Musa's brother Suleiman, who ruled from 1341 to 1360, were not poor men. Suleiman, in particular, maintained the empire with considerable competence, and the Moroccan traveler Ibn Battuta, who visited Mali in 1352 and left the most detailed contemporary account of the empire at its height, describes a court of significant wealth and elaborate ceremony. But the descriptions Ibn Battuta offers, as vivid and compelling as they are, do not convey the kind of staggering, economy destabilizing abundance that characterized the Musa era. The gold is present, clearly. The empire is functioning, clearly. But something has been removed from the equation, and the silence around that removal is itself significant. Ibn Battuta, who was incapable of restraint in his descriptions of extraordinary things, would certainly have mentioned if the treasury of Suleiman's Mali contained the kind of nuggets and gold bars that the older Arabic sources attributed to Musa's vaults. He does not mention them. He describes the court's wealth in terms of the gold dust used for everyday transactions, the golden finials on the royal tent, the gifts distributed to visitors, generous, certainly, but not different in kind from what a well-run medieval Muslim court might display. The deep reserves, the legendary hoard, the nuggets like boulders. These have vanished from the record as completely as if they never existed, and they vanished sometime between 1337, when Musa died, and 1352, when Ibn Battuta arrived. 15 years. 15 years during which the most concentrated private accumulation of gold in human history simply disappeared from every document and every description, as thoroughly as if the sand had swallowed it. 3 possibilities present themselves, and historians have argued about all 3 with considerable vigor. The first is the most prosaic. The gold was gradually distributed, spent, given away, or converted into other forms of wealth, trade goods, infrastructure, military equipment, and the legendary hoard was always more of a narrative construction than a physical reality. This explanation satisfies accountants, but frustrates everyone else, because it requires us to disbelieve a substantial body of Arabic testimony from careful, detail-oriented observers who had no particular motive for inventing the quantities they reported. The second possibility is that the gold was physically moved, hidden, buried, relocated to a site or sites outside the knowledge of the court officials and foreign visitors who might have mentioned it. This is the explanation that oral traditions most strongly support, and it is the one that has driven generations of treasure hunters into the Saharan desert with varying degrees of preparation and varying results, which is to say, none whatsoever. The third possibility is the most unsettling. The gold is still there in its original location, And the reason no one has found it is not that it was cleverly hidden, but that no one has looked in the right place yet. Because the right place is not where conventional archaeological thinking has been directed, and because the landscape itself has been conspiring against discovery for nearly 7 centuries, this instability in the historical record continued until a specific oral tradition collected from Malian griots in the late 19th century by French colonial ethnographers offered a detail so specific that it changed the nature of the treasure question entirely. Then, from the archives of French colonial scholarship, a deeply compromised body of knowledge produced by men who were simultaneously recording and destroying the cultures they studied. A cluster of griot testimonies emerged that deserve far more serious analytical attention than mainstream archaeology has given them. The griots of the Mandinka people are not merely storytellers, they are the formal memory institutions of a culture that chose oral transmission over written record, not because they lacked the capacity for literacy. The Timbuktu manuscripts prove that Malian scholars were perfectly capable of producing written texts in enormous quantities, but because they recognized that a living memory maintained by trained human specialists and updated in real time is more reliable over long periods than any physical document, which can be burned, lost, mistranslated, or deliberately altered. The griots underwent training that typically began in childhood and lasted 20 years or more, during which they memorized not merely narratives, but genealogies, place names, astronomical observations, agricultural calendars, legal precedents, and hundreds of years of political history, all encoded in poetic and musical forms, specifically designed for maximum memorability and minimum distortion across generations. When a griot tells you something happened at a specific place, the specific place is not metaphor. The tradition that matters most for our purposes, the one that has been triangulated against multiple independent griot lineages from different Malian regions, and found to be consistent in its core geographical details, describes what Mansa Musa's court undertook in the years immediately before his death. According to these traditions, Musa recognized that the Mali Empire's succession structure was dangerously unstable. His reign had been the product of a particular historical accident, and the succession battles that followed it would, he reportedly told his closest advisors, inevitably weaken the state's ability to defend its most valuable assets. The gold reserves of the royal treasury, consolidated over decades in the vaults at Niani, represented a concentration of wealth that any ambitious rival king, any invading force from the north, any Tuareg raiding confederation from the Sahara could theoretically seize if they ever breached the capital's defenses. Musa's solution, according to the griot tradition, was characteristically grand in conception and operationally precise in execution. He ordered the bulk of the treasury's gold, not the circulating currency, not the trade goods, not the gold dust used for daily transactions, but the consolidated reserves, the vault gold, the deep hoard, to be removed from Naini in a series of nocturnal convoys and transported to a location or locations outside the empire's most densely settled and therefore most militarily vulnerable core. The griots who preserve this tradition are consistent on several points. The operation took place over multiple years, not in a single dramatic caravan. The gold was moved in small quantities by trusted operatives who were, according to some versions, killed after the operation to prevent the secret from spreading. Though this detail appears in only some versions and may be a later embellishment, the final destination was not a simple hole in the ground, but an engineered structure of some kind. The Griot language describes it using terms that translate roughly as the house beneath the earth or the room the sand has eaten, both phrases that suggest deliberate construction rather than a hastily dug pit. The location of this structure is described in terms of astronomical and geographical landmarks that made precise sense to a pre-colonial West African navigator, but are maddeningly difficult to translate into modern coordinates. A specific relationship between the position of certain stars and the junction of two seasonal watercourses in a landscape that has since been significantly altered by 7 centuries of Saharan desertification. And one final detail, the most tantalizing of all. The griots describe the treasure location as being beneath the land that has 2 faces, a phrase that has been interpreted variously as a description of a landscape feature, an astronomical phenomenon, or a metaphorical reference to a border zone between 2 different types of terrain. The French colonial ethnographer Maurice de Lafosse, who collected several variants of this tradition in the early 20th century, was skeptical of its literal accuracy, but struck by its geographical specificity. He noted in his field reports that the griot traditions he documented showed a level of internal consistency across independent sources that was difficult to explain if the tradition was purely legendary. Different griots from different lineages who had reportedly not communicated with each other about this specific topic described the same landscape features using the same poetic formulas, which suggested a common source that was either historical fact or a very ancient, very deliberately maintained fiction. De Lafosse lacked the resources and the archaeological framework to pursue the question further, and the 2 world wars that followed his fieldwork somewhat interrupted the academic interest in medieval West African treasure. But his notes survived, and they have recently attracted renewed attention from a new generation of scholars, equipped with satellite imagery, ground-penetrating radar, and a considerably less dismissive attitude toward African oral traditions than their colonial predecessors. With the fall of scholarly confidence in purely document-based approaches to West African history, the stage was cleared for a new methodology, one that takes the griots seriously as geographical sources and treats the treasure question not as romantic mythology, but as a legitimate archaeological hypothesis requiring proper investigation. It was at this moment of Mali's maximum power and prestige, within a generation of Mansa Musa's death, that the forces of fragmentation that no amount of gold could buy off began their inexorable work. Musa's son Magan I, who assumed the throne in 1337, was, by every available account, a spectacularly ill-suited heir to one of history's great empires, where his father had been shrewd, generous in calculated ways, and possessed of the political intelligence to hold together a confederation of wildly diverse peoples and interests. Magan appears to have been impulsive, easily distracted, and politically naive to a degree that his contemporaries found baffling. He ruled for only 4 years before his uncle Suleiman pushed him aside. Or perhaps the records of his reign are simply missing, and history has done Magan a disservice by leaving him almost entirely undocumented. What is documented is the consequence. Within a decade of Musa's death, the Mossi kingdoms of the south had launched raids deep into Mali's territory. The Tuareg confederations of the Saharan fringe had reasserted their independence along the northern trade routes, and a vassal state called Songhai, centered on the bend of the Niger River at a city called Gao, had begun the slow process of transitioning from grudging tributary to independent rival. Mansa Suleiman, who ruled from 1341 to 1360, slowed this decline with considerable skill. The Moroccan traveler Ibn Battuta, arriving in 1352, found a court that still maintained elaborate ceremony, still controlled the core of the gold trade, and still commanded genuine respect from its subjects and neighbors. Suleiman's achievement, and it was genuinely impressive, was maintaining functional imperial administration in a state whose fundamental structural problem had not been solved. Too large a territory, too diverse a subject population, and a succession system that generated dangerous competition rather than stable transfer of power. He did not solve these problems. He managed them brilliantly for 19 years. And when he died in 1360, the managing stopped. The period from 1360 to approximately 1430 represents one of the most chaotic succession crises in West African history. 9 different Mansas claimed the throne of Mali in the space of 70 years, an average reign of less than 8 years per ruler. And several of these reigns ended in violence, deposition, or both. The Songhai ruler Sunni Ali Bur, born around 1440, watched this chaos unfold from his capital at Gao and drew the obvious conclusion: the gold of the Western Sudan no longer needed to flow through Malian hands. He spent the next decades systematically dismantling Mali's control over the Niger Bend, capturing Timbuktu in 1468, capturing Janneh after a 7-year siege in 1473, and constructing the Songhai Empire, Mali's direct successor, and in terms of territorial extent, an even larger political entity, on the ruins of Keita authority. However, the most archaeologically significant casualty of this collapse was not military or political, but archival. The Timbuktu manuscripts, those hundreds of thousands of private, mosque, and scholarly library documents that represent perhaps the most significant collection of medieval sub-Saharan African written knowledge in existence, suffered their first great dispersal during this period. Scholars fled. Libraries were packed into bags and transported to desert villages. Manuscripts were buried in sealed containers beneath the floors of houses, beneath the foundations of mosques, in underground chambers in the desert surrounding the city. A pattern of concealment so widespread that modern archaeologists working in the Timbuktu region have repeatedly encountered buried manuscript collections that remained unknown for centuries. The precedent for hiding valuable things underground in this region of the Sahara is not merely legendary. It is extensively documented. It is practically a local architectural tradition, and it begins, most meaningfully, in the era immediately following Mansa Musa's death, the era when hiding became not just prudent, but necessary. Yet, for all the chaos of the succession crisis, for all the territorial losses and the raiding and the disrupted trade routes, one thing remained stubbornly unchanged throughout the entire period. No invading force, no rival king, no ambitious Songhai commander ever reported finding a significant cache of Malian royal gold. Sunni Ali Bur captured Timbuktu, looted it extensively, and left detailed records of what he took. And while the records describe substantial plunder, they do not describe anything resembling the legendary hoard of Mansa Musa. The Songhai chronicles from this period are explicit about the lack of any great treasure discovery, which is either because the hoard never existed as a physical entity, or because it was no longer where anyone thought to look. With the fall of Mali's dominance, Timbuktu entered paradoxically the most brilliant chapter of its intellectual history, a golden age of scholarship funded not by a single royal patron, but by a merchant class grown wealthy from the continued flow of Saharan trade. Sunni Ali Bur died in 1492, the same year Columbus made landfall in the Caribbean, in one of history's more pointed coincidences, and was succeeded by a general named Askia Mohammed Tur, who seized power in 1493 and proceeded to rule the Songhai Empire for 35 years, with a combination of military aggression and cultural patronage that briefly made Timbuktu the most cosmopolitan city in the medieval world. Askia Mohammed is the specific ruler who defines this era, and his achievement was architectural as much as political. He built mosques, endowed libraries, established trading partnerships with Morocco and Egypt and the Ottoman Empire, and turned Timbuktu's already significant intellectual infrastructure into something approaching a genuine university city. The Sankor Mosque and its associated scholars received funding. New mosques were constructed. The manuscript copying industry, already a major economic sector, employing hundreds of scribes who produced books for export across the Islamic world, expanded dramatically. At its peak, the Timbuktu book trade was second in volume only to the gold, and salt trade as a source of mercantile wealth in the city, the single greatest cultural achievement of the Songhai era, was the production of what scholars now call the Timbuktu manuscripts, a collection estimated at somewhere between 300,000 and 1 million individual documents stored across dozens of private family libraries and mosque collections throughout the city and its surrounding villages, covering subjects from Islamic law and astronomy to mathematics, medicine, history, and poetry. These manuscripts represent the most significant surviving body of sub-Saharan African written scholarship from the medieval period, and their existence, long denied or ignored by European historians who preferred to imagine Africa as preliterate, constitutes one of the most powerful archaeological arguments for the sophistication of the civilization that produced Mansa Musa, a culture capable of generating and carefully preserving nearly 1 million written documents, is capable of generating and carefully concealing a significant treasure. This is not a romantic leap of logic. It is a straightforward inference from demonstrated institutional competence. The Songhai Empire at its height under Askia Muhammad controlled approximately 1.4 million square kilometers, larger even than the Mali Empire at its peak, and stretched from the Atlantic coast in the west to the house estates of what is now northern Nigeria in the east. Its gold production continued to be the economic engine of Mediterranean trade, and its military was the most formidable in sub-Saharan Africa, deploying a professional army with cavalry, infantry, and a river navy of war canoes that patrolled the Niger with remarkable tactical sophistication. For nearly a century, Songhai seemed invulnerable. And then, in 1591, a Moroccan army crossed the Sahara. The invasion launched by the Moroccan Sultan Ahmed al-Mansur in 1591 was one of the most audacious military operations in the history of desert warfare. Al-Mansur dispatched approximately 4,000 Moroccan and Spanish soldiers, a force that included a significant contingent of Spanish musketeers, making it one of the first armies in sub-Saharan African history to carry firearms across 1,500 miles of the most inhospitable terrain on Earth. The Songhai military, which had spent a century dominating every neighbor it encountered, apparently did not expect an army to emerge from the desert fully armed and ready for battle. At the Battle of Tondabai in March 1591, the Songhai forces, reportedly numbering in the tens of thousands, met the Moroccan army on the open plain north of Gao, and were routed in a matter of hours, with a decisive assist from the psychological terror of musket fire, which the Songhai cavalry had never encountered, and whose smoke and noise sent their horses into catastrophic panic. The Songhai Empire effectively ended at Tondabai. Gao fell. Timbuktu fell. The city was sacked with the particular enthusiasm of conquerors who had expected more gold than they found. And here the treasure question resurfaces with renewed urgency. The Moroccan pashas who administered the conquered territory of Songhai sent detailed reports back to Al-Mansur in Marrakesh, and those reports have survived in Moroccan archives. They describe the wealth of Timbuktu in terms that are, for a city built on centuries of gold trade, surprisingly modest. The scholars were deported to Morocco. 400 of Timbuktu's most prominent intellectuals, including the great historian Ahmed ibn Muhammad, ibn Ahmed, ibn Ahmed, ibn Muhammad, ibn Umar, ibn Muhammad Alakit, known as Ahmed Baba, who wrote furiously in Moroccan captivity about the injustice of his deportation and the destruction of his library. The gold dust, the trade goods, the immediate liquid wealth of the city, all seized. But the legendary accumulated hoard of the Mali kings, the vault gold that the oral traditions describe being hidden before the empire's collapse, not mentioned, not found. The Moroccan commanders, men who had crossed the Sahara specifically because they believed Timbuktu was sitting on a mountain of gold, came away with considerably less than they anticipated, enough to justify the expedition, but nothing approaching the legendary reserves they had expected. Al-Mansur reportedly expressed disappointment. The letters preserved in the Moroccan archives suggest a man who expected more and got significantly less, and who spent the rest of his reign trying to understand why the expected mountain of gold had turned out to be a more modest hill. It was at this moment of accumulated historical absence, all these centuries of invasions and conquests, that found less gold than expected, that modern archaeology began to ask the question the griots had been answering for 500 years. The archaeological investigation of the Mali Empire's heartland is, by any measure, astonishingly incomplete. The capital city of Niani, the political heart of Mansa Musa's empire, the place where the royal treasury would most logically have been located, the city from which any deliberate relocation of gold reserves would most logically have departed, has received only fragmentary archaeological attention. A joint Guinean-Polish expedition excavated portions of the Niani site in the 1960s and 1970s, uncovering building foundations, ceramic evidence, and significant quantities of imported goods, suggesting a prosperous, cosmopolitan urban center. They found no gold cache, but the excavation covered only a small portion of the total site, and the excavation methodology. Adequate for its era, but primitive by contemporary standards, would not have detected subsurface chambers more than 2 to 3 meters below ground level. The site of ancient Niani lies in what is now southeastern Guinea, near the modern village of Niani, along the Sankarani River. The local communities in this area maintain their own oral traditions about the site. Traditions that the 1960s excavators recorded, but did not fully integrate into their interpretive frameworks. The local traditions describe specific areas of the ancient city as forbidden ground zones where, according to inherited custom, no digging should take place. This kind of prohibition tradition in West African archaeological sites is not unusual, and it is not merely superstitious. In many cases, prohibitions against disturbing specific ground have preserved archaeological sites from the casual looting and agricultural disturbance that have destroyed so many other sites in the region. The question that the 1960s archaeologists did not pursue, the question that has not yet been systematically pursued by any subsequent expedition, is whether the specific locations marked as forbidden ground in the Niani oral tradition correspond in any meaningful way to the underground chamber descriptions in the Griot treasury traditions collected 300 miles to the north. The overlap between the two traditions, the Griot treasury narratives and the Niani prohibited ground traditions, is not complete. The Griot treasury narratives, as we have noted, describe a location in terms that suggest proximity to the Saharan desert margins, rather than the Sahelian forest fringe where Niani is situated. The Niani prohibited ground traditions describe their off-limits areas in terms that suggest something locally significant rather than empire-wide significance. These two bodies of oral testimony are not necessarily describing the same location, and the temptation to force them into correspondence has led more than one amateur treasure hunter badly astray. What they do collectively suggest: the Griot treasury traditions, the Niani prohibitions, the consistent failure of every military conqueror to find expected quantities of Mali gold, and the equally consistent failure of Arab chroniclers after 1340 to describe gold reserves of the magnitude earlier sources attributed to Musa, is that something happened to a very large quantity of gold sometime in the 14th century, and that something was deliberate, organized, and permanent. Ground-penetrating radar surveys of the Saharan landscape between northern Mali and the Mauritanian border have, in recent years, begun to reveal a landscape of extraordinary archaeological complexity beneath the seemingly featureless sand. Satellite imagery processed through algorithms designed to detect subtle surface topography has identified hundreds of previously unknown archaeological sites across the Western Sahara. Sites ranging from ancient campsites to large, formally organized structures whose function has not yet been determined. None of these sites has been excavated. The logistical challenges of conducting systematic archaeological work in one of the most remote, climatically hostile, and in the post-Minas 2012 period of Malian political crisis and jihadi insurgency, actively dangerous regions on Earth are not trivial. Several academic expeditions planned for the early 21st century were cancelled after the 2012 Tuareg rebellion and subsequent Islamist takeover of northern Mali created security conditions that made fieldwork impossible. The landscape is hiding something. We cannot currently go look. Then, from across the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, a new kind of invader arrived in the Western Sudan. And this one did not merely take gold. It took memory itself, the French colonial project in West Africa, which began in earnest with the military conquest of the Western Sudan in the 1880s and was largely complete by 1900, was administered by a generation of French military officers and civilian administrators who brought with them a worldview shaped by 19th century European assumptions about African history. The dominant assumption, shared by virtually every European scholar and administrator of the era, was that sub-Saharan Africa had no meaningful pre-colonial history, that the great empires described by Arab travelers were exaggerations, that the gold wealth of Mali was legend rather than reality, and that the sophisticated oral historical traditions of the Griot system were folk tales rather than reliable historical records. This assumption was not merely ignorant. It was operationally convenient. A people without history have no historical claims, and a culture without genuine pre-colonial institutions has no basis for resistance to colonial reorganization. The French officer Louis Archinard, who led the military conquest of the Western Sudan in the late 1880s and early 1890s, was the specific individual most responsible for the physical destruction of the cultural infrastructure of the region. Archinard conducted his campaigns with a thoroughness that bordered on systematic cultural erasure. He destroyed the library of Ségou when he captured that city in 1890, burning thousands of manuscripts. He dispersed the griots attached to the courts of the kingdoms he conquered, severing the institutional connections between the memory specialists and the communities they served. He imposed a French administrative grid on a landscape organized around entirely different political and social principles, displacing local rulers, reorganizing labor systems, and reorienting trade networks that had operated continuously for centuries. The oral traditions about Mansa Musa's treasury, which had been actively maintained and transmitted at royal courts across the Western Sudan, were among the casualties of this disruption, not eliminated entirely, because no colonial administration is efficient enough to eliminate every strand of oral memory from every community simultaneously, but fragmented, dispersed, and stripped of the institutional support that had kept them coherent and geographically specific for 500 years. The French administrative archives from the colonial period do contain, scattered across dozens of individual reports by district administrators and military officers, fragments of treasure-related oral testimony collected from local informants, usually without proper context, usually filtered through interpreters of varying competence, and usually dismissed in the accompanying administrative notes as native superstition. Several of these reports, examined by post-colonial scholars beginning in the 1970s, contain geographical references that correspond with unexpected precision to specific landscape features in the northern Mali, southern Mauritania border region. One report from 1897, filed by a French military officer named Lapurine during a patrol through the Adrar des Ifaghas plateau of northeastern Mali, describes a local Tuareg informant's account of a place where the ancient kings stored things of value, at a location described in terms of two specific rock formations and a seasonal wadi, a dry riverbed. Lapurine noted the information, filed it under local legends, and moved on. The coordinates of the location he described, reconstructed from his patrol route, place it in a region that has never been archaeologically surveyed and is currently inside the active operating area of militant groups affiliated with Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. The colonial disruption of the Griot tradition had one ironic long-term consequence. It forced the fracturing of a unified tradition into dozens of partial, geographically dispersed fragments, each maintained by different family lineages in different regions, with different emphases and different levels of detail. The process of reassembling these fragments into something approaching the coherent whole that once existed is the work of a generation of West African scholars, working mostly in Bamako and Dakar, and with severely limited funding, who began serious, systematic collection of Griot testimonies in the 1960s, and have continued the work to the present day. The picture that emerges from their collections is fragmented, but not incoherent. The treasury traditions survive in pieces, and the pieces fit together in ways that suggest they descend from a common original, which is exactly what you would expect if the original tradition was anchored in a historical reality that all the fragments, however independently transmitted, ultimately reflect. This instability in the colonial archive continued until the post-colonial scholarship of the late 20th century began the laborious work of reconstructing what the French had disrupted, and uncovered, in the process, something that the colonial administrators had not understood they were suppressing. With the fall of French colonial authority in Mali, independence came on September 22, 1960, when the Sudanese Republic formally became the Republic of Mali, naming itself after the medieval empire with entirely deliberate intent. A new political generation seized the opportunity to reclaim the historical narrative that colonialism had attempted to suppress. Modibo Keita, Mali's first president, and no mere coincidence of surname to the ancient Keita dynasty, made the recovery of pre-colonial Malian history a central element of his nation-building project. He funded the reconstruction of the old capital at Niani, established cultural preservation institutions, commissioned the first systematic collection of Griot oral traditions, and positioned Mali's extraordinary medieval heritage as the cornerstone of a post-colonial national identity built on African achievement rather than European intervention. The griots, who had maintained their traditions in conditions of considerable adversity through the colonial period, emerged into a political environment that, for the first time in a century, actively wanted what they knew. The specific ruler of this era, and every era in Mali's post-colonial history, requires specific naming, because the specific rulers matter enormously to what happened next, was Modibo Keita himself, who governed Mali from 1960 until his overthrow in a military coup in 1968. Keita's 8 years in power were sufficient to establish the institutional infrastructure for historical and cultural recovery. The Ahmed Baba Institute in Timbuktu, eventually housing over 70,000 manuscripts, the National Museum in Bamako, the university system that trained Mali's first generation of professional historians and archaeologists. But they were not sufficient to complete the work, and the military juntas that followed Keita, Moussa Traoré, ruled from 1968 to 1991, presiding over a period of economic stagnation and political repression that left archaeological research chronically underfunded, created conditions in which the treasure question became, once again, a matter of whispered private tradition rather than public scholarly inquiry. The Democratic Revolution of 1991, which brought Alpha Aumar Konaré to the presidency and lasted until the coup of 2012, represented the second significant opening for serious engagement with Mali's pre-colonial heritage. Konaré, himself a trained historian, understood the archaeological significance of the Timbuktu manuscripts better than perhaps any other head of state in the world, and his administration's support for the Ahmed Baba Institute's manuscript preservation project produced results that astonished the international scholarly community. By the early 2000s, it was becoming clear that the number of surviving manuscripts in the Timbuktu region was far larger than anyone had previously estimated. With new family libraries and buried collections surfacing regularly as local communities, encouraged by preservation funding, came forward with documents they had maintained secretly for generations. The manuscripts that came to light during this period included several previously unknown historical chronicles of the Mali Empire period. Fragmentary, damaged, and requiring years of careful restoration work, but containing geographical and administrative details that had simply not been available to earlier scholars. The cultural achievement of the post-colonial era's manuscript recovery project is genuinely extraordinary. The Ahmed Baba Institute, working in collaboration with South African and international partners through the Timbuktu Manuscripts Project, cataloged and digitized tens of thousands of manuscripts before the catastrophe of 2012. And when the jihadist occupation of northern Mali in that year threatened to destroy the Timbuktu Library, it was local Malian citizens operating at considerable personal risk who dismantled the collections, packed them into trunks and boxes and bags, and transported them south to Bamako in a months-long operation that was nothing less than the greatest act of cultural rescue in the 21st century. The manuscripts survived, and among them, examined by scholars in Bamako and Cape Town over the years since their rescue, are several documents that bear, with tantalizingly oblique language, on the question of what happened to Mansa Musa's treasury. Yet even with independence, even with serious scholarly infrastructure, even with the recovery of manuscripts and the renewed respect for Griot testimony, the physical search for the treasury remained impossible. The political crisis that began in 2012, the Tuareg rebellion, the military coup, the jihadist occupation of the north, closed off the very region where the most promising geographical indicators from both oral and documentary traditions converge. The treasure, if it exists, lies in a landscape currently controlled by people who are not interested in archaeological surveys. It was at this moment of scholarly nearness and physical inaccessibility that the history of treasure hunting in the Sahara deserves its own examination. Because the trail of failed expeditions trying to find Mansa Musa's gold is nearly as long and nearly as interesting as the trail of the gold itself. The first documented European attempt to locate the legendary Mali gold reserves was not motivated by archaeological curiosity, but by commercial greed of the most straightforward variety. A series of Portuguese maritime expeditions along the West African coast in the 15th and 16th centuries, directed partly by the same legends about Malian gold that had circulated in Mediterranean trading networks since Musa's Hajj. The Portuguese discovered the goldfields of West Africa, established trading relationships with coastal kingdoms, and extracted gold, but not the legendary treasury of the ancient Mali kings, because the coastal goldfields were not where the treasury was, assuming it existed, and because the Portuguese never penetrated far enough inland to reach the Mali heartland. The 19th century produced a succession of European explorers, driven by the same mixture of geographical curiosity, commercial interest, and romantic imagination that characterized the era's engagement with Africa generally. The Scotsman Mungo Park reached the Niger River in 1796 and died on it in 1806. The Frenchman René Caillié reached Timbuktu in 1828, disguised as an Arab because being a known European in the Sahara was a reliable way to be killed, and found a city that was, by his account, a considerable disappointment after the legends. Dusty, poor, showing clear signs of economic decline since the Moroccan conquest of 1591. He found no treasure. The German Heinrich Barth, who spent 5 years traveling across the western and central Sudan in the early 1850s, was a more rigorous observer than his predecessors, and produced detailed accounts of the Timbuktu manuscripts he encountered. But he too found no evidence of a surviving physical treasure cache. What all 3 explorers did find, in varying degrees, was a landscape that had been deeply marked by centuries of accumulated wealth. The architectural remains of prosperous Islamic cities, the remnants of sophisticated trading infrastructure, the presence of scholarly and griot communities still maintaining fragments of historical memory, despite decades of economic decline and political instability. The 20th century added a new category of treasure seeker: the professional gold prospector. The colonial era surveys of the Western Sudan, conducted by French geological services in the 1920s and 1930s, were motivated partly by the search for workable mineral deposits, and partly by the residual hope that somewhere in the Saharan landscape lay a concentration of gold that would justify the enormous expense of the colonial project. The geological surveys found gold. The Bambuk and Lulo-Gonkoto gold deposits in western Mali are still being mined today, and the Siama gold mine in southern Mali has been in production since the 1990s. But they did not find any archaeological gold concentration that would correspond to a medieval treasury. The geological surveys were, of course, not designed to detect archaeological features. They were looking for mineral deposits in bedrock, not engineered chambers in sediment. The most serious semi-scholarly attempt to locate the Mali royal treasury in the 20th century was conducted not by Westerners, but by a Malian researcher named Lansana Kaba, who spent years in the 1970s and 1980s systematically interviewing griot families across Mali and Guinea, attempting to triangulate the geographical references in the treasury tradition against modern maps and landscape descriptions. Kaba's work, published in fragments in several West African academic journals and referenced in his larger scholarly study of the Mandinka oral tradition, identified a zone of interest roughly 200 kilometers northeast of Bamako, in a region where the Saharan and Sahelian ecological zones overlap, and where several seasonal watercourses converge in ways that correspond to landscape descriptions in multiple independent griot accounts. Kaba was unable to conduct physical investigation of this zone. He was a historian, not an archaeologist, and he had no funding for fieldwork. But his published analysis of the geographical references was specific enough to attract the attention of at least one international archaeological team that subsequently attempted to organize a survey expedition. That expedition was canceled following the 1991 coup. A second attempt was planned for 2011. The 2012 crisis ended that one as well. The zone of interest identified by Kaaba remains completely unsurveyed, then from a direction that neither the treasure hunters nor the archaeologists had been looking. A group of economic historians began to advance a claim that fundamentally changes the stakes of the treasure question. Their argument, developed over the past 2 decades through careful analysis of medieval Mediterranean price records, Egyptian and Moroccan financial documents, and comparative economic data from across the 14th century Islamic world, is this Mansa Musa's 1,324 Hajj was not merely an embarrassing episode in which an extravagant king temporarily disrupted gold prices. It was a turning point in the history of global finance and the chain of economic consequences it set in motion, including the collapse of gold values, the shift in Mediterranean trade patterns, the economic destabilization of several North African states, and the changed incentives that redirected European maritime exploration southward along the African coast, contributed through a sequence of steps that can be traced with reasonable confidence to the conditions that made Christopher Columbus's 1,492 voyage possible and commercially viable. The argument runs roughly as follows. Before Musa's Hajj, the gold supply of the Mediterranean world was relatively stable, and European economies were calibrated to function within that stable gold supply. Musa's distribution of gold in 1,324 and the subsequent decade of depressed gold prices pushed European, particularly Portuguese, Genoese, and Spanish merchants and financiers to seek alternative sources of gold and alternative commercial routes that bypassed the now disrupted North African gold trade. This search for alternatives was a significant driver behind the systematic Portuguese exploration of the West African coast, beginning in the 1430s under Prince Henry the Navigator, an exploration program funded by merchants who were explicitly looking for a sea route to the gold sources of sub-Saharan Africa that would bypass the Saharan caravan routes disrupted by the economic chaos following Musa's Hajj. The Portuguese eventually found what they were looking for, establishing direct maritime trading relationships with the goldfields of modern Ghana in the 1470s, and the competitive pressure of Portuguese maritime expansion, in turn, drove Spanish investors to back Columbus's westward voyage as an alternative route to the same Asian and African luxury markets. In this reading, Mansa Musa's extraordinary generosity in Cairo in 1,324 is a distant but traceable ancestor of European colonialism in the Americas, a chain of economic consequence spanning 100 168 years and 2 oceans, initiated by one man's decision to hand out gold dust in a foreign marketplace. Whether this argument is fully convincing, as stated, is a matter of legitimate historical debate. Economic historians tend to be skeptical of single-cause explanations for complex, multi-generational processes, and the chain of causation from Musa's Hajj to Columbus's voyage involves enough contingency and enough other contributing factors that claiming direct lineage requires considerable qualification. But the core insight that the redistribution of what may have been the world's largest private gold hoard into the global economy had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate economic disruption and shaped the subsequent history of European expansion in ways that are still being worked out today, is taken seriously by a growing body of economic and historical scholarship. The gold of Mali did not merely buy mosques and manuscripts. It helped reshape the global economy in ways whose full consequences we are still, 700 years later, inheriting. Yet for all the vast intellectual architecture that historians and economists have built around Mansa Musa's legend, the country that bears his empire's name has spent the past decade living through a crisis whose roots lie, with painful irony, in precisely the kind of political fragmentation that destroyed the Mali Empire in the first place. Assimi Goïta, the military officer who launched a coup in August 2020 and a second coup in May 2021, currently leads Mali as the head of a transitional government that has broken with the country's former French patrons, expelled French and UN peacekeeping forces, and invited the Wagner Group, Russian private military contractors with a documented record of extreme violence against civilian populations, to provide security assistance in the fight against the Saharan jihadi groups that have been destabilizing the north since 2012. The parallels to the medieval era are too exact to be comfortable. A militarily capable central government in the south unable to effectively control a vast northern periphery, relying on outside military assistance that brings its own political complications, while the population of the northern cities, Timbuktu, Gao, Kittle, endures the consequences of a conflict they did not choose. The Ahmed Baba Institute, which houses the most significant collection of Mali's medieval manuscript heritage, has operated under conditions of intermittent crisis since 2012. The manuscripts that survived the jihadist occupation and the dramatic rescue operation are gradually being digitized through international partnerships. South Africa's government has been a particularly important partner, but the physical institution in Timbuktu has been repeatedly disrupted by security incidents, staff departures, and funding shortfalls. The cultural infrastructure that Modibo Keita began building in the 1960s, that Alpha Aumar Konaré expanded in the 1990s, exists today in a state of chronic fragility, maintained by dedicated local scholars and librarians who continue their work in conditions of genuine personal risk. The Griot tradition itself, the living memory institution that has preserved fragments of the treasury tradition for 7 centuries, faces a challenge that no military invasion or political crisis has previously managed to impose on it. Modernity, the economic forces that push young people in Mali away from the 20-year apprenticeships that Griot training requires toward urban employment and digital media, are more effective at disrupting oral transmission than any colonial policy. The current generation of master griots, many of them in their 70s and 80s, are working urgently to document their knowledge in recorded and written form before it passes beyond recovery. Several NGOs and academic institutions have active recording programs racing against demographic time. The treasure tradition, along with everything else the griots carry, is being captured in digital audio and video at libraries and cultural centers in Bamako, Ségou, and Mopti, preserved now in a different medium than the one that carried it for 7 centuries, available to researchers in ways it never was before, but stripped of the living, updated, geographically precise quality that made it a dynamic historical record rather than a fixed text. The gold mines of Mali, meanwhile, continue producing. The Loulo-Gounkoto gold mine complex in western Mali, operated by Randgold Resources, and now by its successor Barrick Gold, extracted approximately 700,000 troy ounces of gold in 2022 from the same general region of the Western Sudan where the Bambuk goldfields operated in Mansa Musa's era. The Siama mine in southern Mali, the Fekola mine near the Senegalese border. These are modern industrial operations extracting gold from the same geological formations that made the Mali Empire the world's dominant gold producer 7 centuries ago. The gold of Mansa Musa's empire is still coming out of the ground. It is just going to Swiss banks and London markets, rather than to the treasury of a king who might give it away in a Cairo marketplace. Whether that represents progress, regression, or simply the latest chapter in an 800-year story of extraction, is a question this documentary will not presume to answer. The question that drives this story: where, if anywhere, is Mansa Musa's legendary hoard? Does not have a definitive answer that current scholarship can provide. What current scholarship can provide, and what we have tried to demonstrate throughout this documentary, is a framework for taking the question seriously rather than dismissing it as romantic mythology. The consistency of the Arabic chronicles in describing gold reserves of extraordinary scale before 1337. The equally consistent failure of those same chronicles and subsequent military invasions to account for those reserves after 1337. The Griot traditions, maintained across independent lineages with geographical specificity that is difficult to explain as pure invention. The pattern of deliberate underground concealment documented throughout the Timbuktu region in both the manuscript and the archaeological records, the security constraints that have prevented systematic investigation of the landscape zones most strongly implicated by the combined oral and documentary evidence. These are not the components of a legend. They are the components of a historical mystery, one that requires, and has not yet received, the full application of modern archaeological methodology in conditions that permit safe fieldwork. There are scholars in Bamako today who believe the answer is findable, not by treasure hunters with metal detectors, and not by foreign expeditions treating the Western Sahara as an archaeological playground, but by properly conducted, adequately funded, community-engaged archaeological research conducted in partnership with the Griot communities, whose geographical memory represents the most direct surviving link to the answer. What prevents this research is not intellectual incapacity. It is security. It is funding. It is the grinding political crisis that has consumed northern Mali for over a decade, and it is, perhaps, the same quality of the landscape itself, the shifting, covering, patient Saharan sand that concealed whatever is down there in the first place. The sand is not malicious. It simply does not care about our questions. It has been covering the evidence for 700 years, and it will continue covering it with perfect indifference to our urgency. Connect the threads from the medieval to the modern, and the picture that emerges is not of a lost treasure passively waiting to be found, but of an active, ongoing tension between memory and erasure, between the deep human desire to preserve and the equally deep forces, political, climatic, economic, that conspire to make preservation impossible. The French colonial project tried to erase the memory. The Griot tradition survived it. The jihadist occupation of 2012 tried to burn the manuscripts. Local citizens smuggled them to safety. The Wagner Group's presence in Mali today represents not a new kind of intervention, but a continuation of the oldest pattern in the region's history. Outside powers projecting force into the Saharan trade corridor for reasons that are fundamentally about control of resources. And the people of Mali, as they have always done, negotiating their survival between and around those outside powers with a tenacity that 7 centuries of alternating catastrophe and brilliance has done nothing to diminish. Mansa Musa himself, the man stripped of legend, stripped of the astronomical wealth figures and the economy-breaking generosity and the glittering caravans, was a ruler who understood something that most powerful men throughout history have failed to grasp, that the demonstration of power is not the same as the exercise of power, and that gold distributed strategically, gold displayed magnificently, gold given away with theatrical generosity, is a more effective political instrument than gold hoarded in locked vaults. His Hajj was not extravagance. It was diplomacy. It was the projection of Mali's power across the entire Islamic world in terms that could not be ignored or denied. Terms of raw material abundance, so spectacular that it embedded his empire in the mental geography of every court from Morocco to Egypt for generations after his death. He understood that the story of the gold was as powerful as the gold itself, and the story has outlasted everything. It has outlasted the empire, outlasted the dynasty, outlasted the caravans and the mosques and the market cities, outlasted colonialism and coups and jihadist occupations and proxy wars. 700 years after a king walked out of West Africa on his way to Mecca with 60,000 porters and 100 camels loaded with gold, his name generates more Google searches per year than most currently serving heads of state. His legacy funds academic conferences and museum exhibitions from London to Lagos and somewhere beneath the burning Saharan sands, in a place that the shifting dunes may have already swallowed beyond any recovery, or may be preserving with the indifferent patience of geography. There may lie the physical confirmation of a story that the griots have been telling since before your great-great-great-grandfather was born. The current military government of Assimi Goïta in Bamako shows no particular interest in the treasure question, being rather more urgently concerned with the questions of territorial control, jihadist insurgency, and Russian military partnership that consume every working hour of its administration. The scholars in the Ahmed Baba Institute continue their digitization work between power cuts and security scares. The griots continue recording their traditions in languages that fewer young people speak every year, and the Saharan sand continues its work of covering and uncovering, hiding and revealing in the cycle of desiccation and erosion that has been reshaping the landscape since the first herders of the Green Sahara were pushed southward toward the Niger River 5,000 years ago, carrying with them, perhaps, the instinct for concealment that would one day lead a king to hide the greatest fortune in human history from everyone who came after him, including us. The gold of Mansa Musa has not been found, and in a Mali still fighting over its own sovereignty, with ancient griot memories racing against digital amnesia, and Saharan sand silently swallowing 7 centuries of buried truth, the question of where history's greatest fortune lies remains as open, as urgent, and as hauntingly unresolved as the day the last shovel of earth was turned over a secret that no one alive today was meant to know. That is the story of Mansa Musa and the lost gold of Mali. If this documentary opened a door in your mind that you did not know was there, the absolute minimum thing you can do is hit that like button and subscribe. It costs you nothing, and it tells the algorithm that this kind of serious, in-depth historical storytelling is worth surfacing for other people. Drop a comment below telling me where in the world you are watching from right now. And most importantly, tell me what story you want next. the Songhai Empire and Sunni Ali Burr, the buried libraries of Timbuktu, the gold mines of Great Zimbabwe, and the mystery of who built them, the lost empire of Aksum in Ethiopia. Every comment is a vote, and the most requested topic becomes the next script. I read every comment. I see every location, and wherever you are watching from tonight, Lahore, Lagos, London, Riyadh, New York, Nairobi, you are part of a global community that believes history is worth telling properly. See you in the next one.